Hello there, my RPG lovers, and welcome to another video. Mortal Shell has finally been released. We talked about this game a few months ago on the channel, and in the meantime it got a lot of attention. Pretty much everyone heard about this game in one way or another. That actually makes me happy for this developer, because not a lot of indie games of this type get the same treatment. And I was actually kind of worried before the game released, because too much hype can also mean too much disappointment. People start having high expectations, and considering that Mortal Shell is developed by only 15 people, it seemed too good to be true. Whether you love it or not, Soulsborne genre is kinda getting overcrowded lately. A lot of indie developers started making these types of games. I believe Hellpoint is the last bigger release in this subgenre. But Mortal Shell managed to separate itself from the rest, mainly because of the production value, and I believe that a lot of people won't even suspect that this game is actually made by a really small team. But does it actually avoid having some usual problems that we can expect from low-budget Soulsborne titles? Well, let's find out. Mortal Shell has a really interesting premise, and that was apparent right from the start when they released the first trailer for the game. You're just an empty husk, and you're looking for shells to inhabit. To be honest, I thought that this will be just a little gimmick that's supposed to make the game unique in a way. Well, it's definitely unique, but it's far from a gimmick. Inhabiting different shells is actually a huge feature. You don't get to make your character in Mortal Shell, and the way you progress your character is actually really unique. You're gathering resources by killing enemies obviously, and you use that to learn more about the shell that you unlocked. In that process, you can increase different stats and abilities from the shell and get a part of the shell's origin story. It's a cool concept and it's definitely unique, but I have a couple of problems with some design decisions when it comes to this. But we'll talk about that when we get to the gameplay. The story itself is exactly what you would expect from a game like this. Dark, confusing, non-linear, and really subtle. Look, I have no idea what's actually going on here, but I really liked how they presented the background story about shells that you can inhabit. There are 4 shells that you can discover, each with their own unique story and gameplay benefits. You don't even know the name of the shell when you find it, you have to invest a small amount of resource first. After that, you will get to hear a small voice-acted part of the story.
Existence is a curious matter. The greatest triumph in the universe, gifted and squandered.
This will happen each time you invest points in your shell. You won't get to hear a lot of voice acting in the game because there is hardly any dialogue, but when it happens, it's actually pretty decent. Learning more about the tragic history of different shells is like a little puzzle game, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. Especially because all shells are fairly different and unique. Mortal Shell has an interesting design philosophy when it comes to certain gameplay features. You won't find a traditional character progression as you would probably expect from a game like this. There are no levels and in-depth character stats. The whole character progression system is quite streamlined, if not a bit limited. That's not so apparent right from the beginning, but you start realizing this after a few hours. But before we discuss this further, let's talk about the actual gameplay. How does it feel, how it controls, are the animations clunky, etc, etc. Those are the questions that people usually ask when it comes to indie Soulsborne titles. Mortal Shell has really good animations in general. Indie Soulsborne games can struggle a lot with animations, which can usually turn some people off. I believe that won't be the case with Mortal Shell because everything looks and feels smooth. Actually, considering the budget of this game, animations are amazing. That's one of the strongest parts when it comes to the presentation of this game and why it managed to gather so much attention from the trailers. But this wouldn't matter a lot if the game doesn't control well. Luckily, the controls are pretty good as well, I didn't have any major issues. Except the fact that you can't jump at all in this game. It's not a huge problem, but it feels weird sometimes, especially in situations like this. But more importantly, the combat doesn't lack weight. Every attack feels impactful, mainly because of the good sound effects and animations. The hitboxes are pretty good as well, it never felt unfair when I died. The most unique mechanic when it comes to the combat is definitely the harden ability. There is no block button in Mortal Shell, you can't actively block attacks. but instead you have the ability called Harden, which is basically a stone form. At first, it might seem like a glorified block ability, but it's more than that. It's a great defensive and offensive ability, depends on how you use it. If enemies hit you while you're in this form, they will usually stagger, which gives you the opportunity for a counter attack. You can even use it in the middle of your attack animations. So, for example, you can do a leaping attack and harden, and when you get hit, your attack animation will continue. This ability has a cooldown, of course, which prevents it from being OP. There are a couple of items that you can find, which will give you some bonus effects for this ability. Some of the upgrades from shells will also give you some extra effects for harden. Overall, it's a pretty good mechanic and it works properly. I'm not entirely sure how to feel about the lack of traditional blocking, but since the game works fine without it, I guess I can't complain. But here are some things that I can complain about. Let's go back to the character progression system. I don't actually think it's bad, but I believe that a lot of people will be surprised to learn how it works. Maybe because they will expect something similar to Dark Souls games, which would be reasonable, I guess. To put it simply, Mortal Shell basically has 4 predetermined characters that you can play, or shells if you will. That's definitely an oversimplification, but it's not far from the truth. Each shell has predetermined stats in terms of health, stamina and resolve. Resolve is used for special abilities, we'll talk about that soon. Anyway, you can't increase the stamina and health of your shell by investing points into those stats. So you have to choose the shell that suits your playstyle. But you can switch between them seamlessly with certain items that you can find in the game or in one of the hub areas. Same goes for the weapons as well. Each shell has unique ability points that you can learn by visiting Sester Janessa and spending your currency. Don't expect to find a lot of build variety in Mortal Shell, the character progression is pretty linear. What you see is what you get. You are basically just unlocking the full potential of the shell. And I'm not saying this is bad, it's just limited. There are no armor sets that you can find, or any armor pieces actually, all you have are 4 different shells and their unique design. Same goes for the weapons as well. You have 4 different melee weapons in the game and 1 ranged weapon. Each of those weapons have different attack animations and unique upgrades that you can find. I tried using them all, but I mostly played with Hollowed Sword, which is the first weapon that you find in the game. I think it's the most balanced weapon all around. The moveset is great and it has the best sprinting attack in the game by far. It's possibly a little bit OP as well. I really couldn't feel heavier weapons, especially in boss fights. They have a good stagger and knockdown chance, but they slow down the gameplay quite a bit. You can find items that will enhance your weapons and give you a unique weapon ability. These abilities require a special resource called Resolve that I mentioned before. You gain Resolve by dealing damage to enemies and using special items. Resolve is also used for parrying and executing ripostes. You can get 4 riposte abilities that you can use, and they are pretty powerful. Mortal Shell is kinda obsessed with the number 4 if you didn't notice. The parry mechanic is rewarding as it should be, but I didn't use it a lot in my playthrough. This is kinda weird because I usually like to parry a lot in these types of games. I just couldn't feel it in Mortal Shell for some reason, but it's a really powerful ability if you manage to pull it off, as you would imagine. To tell you the truth, I really don't know how to feel about the lack of actual stats on weapons. All you get is a short description, which will update if you enhance your weapon. There are no damage numbers. The only actual stats in the game are on shells, where you can see the amount of health, stamina and resolve, and that's it. I'm not a huge fan of this design decision, even though this by itself doesn't actually make the game worse. There's another really interesting mechanic that I still haven't mentioned. Instead of instantly dying when you receive enough damage, you'll be kicked out of your shell. If you receive any more damage before you go back to your shell, then you will die. And if you successfully manage to return to your shell, your health will completely regenerate. But if you take enough damage after this, you will be dead for real. There is an item that can reset this ability, so you can use it twice before you die. This will be extremely useful, especially in the beginning of the game. When it comes to the level design and enemy variety, Mortal Shell is struggling a bit. This game has a couple of different locations which are connected with the loading screen. While there are shortcuts here and there, the locations in Mortal Shell are not actually designed around this philosophy. But most of the time you'll have a couple of different paths to take. You will either end up where you need to go, find some unique loot or fight a unique mini-boss, and then you'll go back where you came from. From all the locations in the game, the first swampy/forest area seems to be the most developed. I definitely think this is the best location in the game, even though I'm not a huge fan of the color palette they decided to use here. Other locations in the game are more straightforward, you don't have a lot of branching paths. Except the Eternal Narthex, I guess, which uses portals to navigate. Despite this, the locations are fairly interesting, but I expected more locations like Falgrim, at least when it comes to the overall design. Mortal Shell has a decent amount of enemies to fight considering the length of the game, but is still reusing some enemies in certain places. This didn't bother me a lot, but it might be a problem for some people. This is nothing unusual in the lower budget Souls-like games. But let's be honest, it's still a problem. All boss fights in Mortal Shell are unique and the difficulty feels decent. They are not extremely hard, but they have a decent amount of challenge. This will of course depend on your own skill level and your experience with similar games. I usually talk about the visuals in the beginning, but I felt like I need to talk about the gameplay first because it's obviously really important. The game looks good in general, but like I said, I didn't like the color palette in the first area. I had to turn up the brightness a bit because it was really hard to see sometimes. Other than that, it's looking good if you can actually manage to play it on higher settings. And if my GTX 1060 can handle 60 plus FPS for the most time, I guess the optimization is pretty good. Weapon and armor design is decent, but that's to be expected when you only have 4 of each type, I guess. Nevertheless, they have a decent design. And the same can be said for most of the things in the game. You can't expect some crazy graphical fidelity when it comes to indie games, but Mortal Shell looks pretty good as a whole package. It runs on Unreal Engine 4, so that's not a huge surprise, I guess. I already mentioned the sound in the gameplay part, but let's talk about that for a second. The sound effects are great, and they deserve to be praised. Weapon swings, monster sounds, ambient sounds, your breathing while you're low on stamina, and pretty much everything else related to sound is great. Like we already mentioned before, the voice acting is pretty good, even though you can't hear a lot of it.
Cruelties. They know better than to attack us.
The music is almost non-existing because most of the tracks are the mix of ambient sounds. And to be honest, it actually works for this kind of a game. I actually prefer this over Dark Souls' dramatic tracks. It's much more immersive and unsettling in my opinion. Overall, the sound is one of the best things about the game. Now let's draw a conclusion. Mortal Shell is definitely a good game, but it has some problems. Most of the problems that I mentioned in the video could be forgiven if we take in consideration the length of the game. While I didn't like some design decisions, I did enjoy my first playthrough of this game. But I'm not really excited to start another playthrough of the game because, to be honest, I don't see a lot of reasons to replay it. Other than trying to unlock everything for all the shells in the game, but I don't think I'm gonna do that. For a game that's made by a really small indie team, it's definitely impressive and I can't wait to see what they're going to do in the future. But it feels like they spent a lot of resources for presentation and marketing. So would I recommend this game for 30 euros? Well, it depends. If you really like Soulsborne games and you can't get enough of them, absolutely. It's also a very good starting game that could get you interested in other games of this genre. So it's a good game to pick up if you want to get into this genre. But if you're looking for Dark Souls 4 or something similar, you will be disappointed because this game is far from that. It has a couple of unique ideas, but they are not without its problems. And that would be all for this video. Tell me your opinions about Mortal Shell in the comments below. Was the hype justified, or do you think the game is disappointing? If you enjoyed this video, pressing the thumbs up button would mean a lot. Don't forget to subscribe for more content and click on the bell icon so you don't miss any future uploads. Special thanks to my Patreons, and if you as well want to become one of them, all the links are in the description. Patreon is definitely the best place to directly support my work, and every contribution is highly appreciated. That would be all, and I'll see you in the next one.